Senhoras e senhores, sejam muito bem-vindos ao último dia da 10ª Conferência APAH, subordinada ao tema Nova Governação em Saúde. O dia de hoje terá início com a APAH Talks, que nos darão a visão do exemplo da governação dos hospitais no modelo inglês e no modelo holandês. Seguidamente, contamos com a presença do Conselho de Finanças Públicas, que fará a apresentação do relatório Setor Empresarial do Estado 2019-2020. Seguir-se-á a terceira sessão plenária temática desta 10ª edição da Conferência de Valor, dedicada ao tema A Emergência da Governação Centrada no Cidadão. A terminar o dia, teremos a quarta e última sessão plenária temática com enfoque na nova governação em saúde, o que propõem os partidos políticos. O dia encerra com a entrega do Prémio Coriolano Ferreira 2022, premiando o melhor aluno do curso de especialização em Administração Hospitalar da Escola Nacional de Saúde Pública. Recordamos que todas as sessões serão simultaneamente presenciais e virtuais e os interessados podem assistir à iniciativa quer através da plataforma, quer através das redes sociais, Facebook e canal YouTube da APAH. Vamos então dar início à APAH Talk, Governação dos Hospitais, o modelo inglês. Contamos com a participação remota dos oradores Nigel Edwards e doutora Helen Buckingham, da Nuffield Trust.
Bem, muito obrigado. Bom dia a todos. É um prazer estar a encerrar o último dia destas 10ª Conferências de Valor. Foram 4 dias muito intensos. Particularmente estes 2 dias que temos estado em formato híbrido e em formato virtual e em formato presencial, portanto em formato híbrido. E o dia de hoje vai ser realmente muito cheio na prática este dia vai ser muito dedicado também e continuar a discutir os modelos de governação. Para nos ajudar a discutir os modelos de governação, nada melhor do que conhecer exemplos de outros países. E no caso de hoje vamos discutir particularmente um modelo inglês e um modelo holandês. Como vemos, são realidades bastante distintas, mas que evidentemente podemos aprender com ambas as experiências. Para nos ajudar a compreender estes modelos, temos 3 peritos internacionais. O Nigel Edwards, a Helen Buckingham, para falar do modelo inglês, o Nuffield Trust. O Nuffield Trust é um think tank, porventura o mais relevante think tank sobre saúde no Reino Unido, e ambos têm uma enorme experiência profissional também na gestão do setor da saúde. O Nigel Edwards na gestão hospitalar e também como presidente da NHS Confederation, na prática na Associação dos Hospitais, e a Helen como diretora do Monitor, que é a organização, que ela vai falar um pouco, que faz a regulação financeira de unidades descentralizadas, que são os NHS Trust, que são um modelo que vai ser apresentado, um modelo de hospitais. Portanto, vai ser uma manhã, creio que intensa, bastante interessante, esta primeira metade da manhã, dedicada realmente a perceber como é que funcionam os sistemas, e eu convidava-vos desde já a colocarem questões e perguntas, porque me parece muito relevante que saibamos aprender com estas experiências para, evidentemente, também conseguirmos evoluir sobre o modelo português. Para finalizar, é importante reconhecer que estes modelos não são perfeitos, aliás, como o nosso, mas, evidentemente, podemos sempre aprender com as evoluções que estes modelos tiveram e também, na prática, evitar alguns contratempos que estes modelos também tiveram ao longo do tempo. Portanto, eu passava desde já, não sei se o Nigel e a Helen estão online, e eu passaria. Good morning, Nigel. Good morning, Helen. It's a pleasure to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm very sorry that we're not able to be with you in person. Although the sun is shining here in London, I don't think it will be as nice as where you are. So we're going to talk a bit about the foundation trust model in the English NHS. The other parts of the UK had a different model, and we'll try and disentangle what was hoped would happen from what actually did happen. And it's quite difficult because the model evolved and changed over time. But we will give you an overview, and there will be an opportunity to explore details later. The idea of foundation trust came after a period of very direct political involvement in hospital management, which from the politician's point of view was not working well. It involved the Secretary of State for Health, the most senior minister, being asked questions in Parliament about the details of a scandal about the storage of bodies in a hospital mortuary. And I think this made the politician concerned, Alan Milburn, feel that he needed to get away from some of that. There was also, I think, a political theory from some of the special advisors that there was an opportunity to improve the performance of hospitals through more devolution of power. So adopting a principle of subsidiarity, where decisions are made as close to the clinical front line as is practical, of creating organisations that gave stakeholders and staff more of a feeling of commitment and sense of ownership in the organisation, and to release some entrepreneurial activity and innovation by removing some of the very top-down performance management that characterised hospital management at the time. The politicians went to Spain to look at the fundaciones there, and to Sweden. Ironically, it was a Labour government. They didn't seem to be aware that both those models were directly copied from a previous experiment with independent, more autonomous hospitals that Mrs. Thatcher had developed. They were then adapted to several different flavours, different types of model in Spain, and the model in Sweden again owed some of its history to Mrs. Thatcher. I think we didn't tell the politicians that at the time. It might have put them off. So at the time, just some context, the NHS was operating an internal market in which hospital care was purchased by organisations called primary care trusts, who effectively were commissioners or payers for those services. The hospitals were paid via a type of DRG reimbursement system. There was a policy of introducing patient choice, particularly for planned care. Quality was guaranteed by, in theory at least, by an independent inspector. We've had various versions of these, but they used a combination of routine data analysis and visits. And then it's worth knowing that in our system at the time, hospitals already did have freedoms to hire and fire, to develop their own budgets and to set strategy. So we're not talking here about the type of very heavily ministerial controlled hospital systems that you might find in some former Soviet Union countries, or for example in Greece, with line item budgets and controls on how many staff you can employ. Hospitals did have some freedoms in this area already, so that's important to know, because it means that they already had a degree of managerial competence and infrastructure to take advantage of some of the freedoms that they were then going to be given. So the idea of foundation trusts was a public corporation. They were a novel legal form. I think the details of this are not really very interesting, even in the UK context, even less, I think, in yours. One important thing, however, because of the politics, there was... Oh, I'm getting an echo, sorry. Could someone mute the room, because I'm getting feedback? Thank you. That's better. Good. There was a political anxiety that if hospitals failed, then the assets could be sold, and I think people were concerned that this could be an inadvertent route to the privatisation of elements of the NHS. So they were not allowed to sell assets. With that, all of their assets, they could dispose of surplus property and buildings, but they couldn't just cease to exist and be sold. And we'll talk about that more. In terms of their freedom, they could set their own strategy. They could negotiate staff employment conditions and pay, which in the NHS at the time were nationally negotiated. I have to say that very few of them took advantage of that. It turns out to be quite a difficult freedom to use. They could create and retain surpluses. Quite important. In the previous budgeting system, if you made a surplus, you lost it, and there was the end of every financial year there would be a desperate scrabble to spend money, and furniture and equipment would be bought that was often not needed simply to spend the budget. So they didn't need to do that anymore. They could retain the surpluses that they made, and they could borrow. But within defined limits, and we'll come back to the issues of how of borrowing and capital a little later, because it seems that this is actually not as straightforward. If you've still got a public corporation and they're allowed to borrow, then this creates an obligation on the national public sector debt, and so. While in theory you're autonomous, you have the Ministry of Finance being anxious about the extent to which there are public bodies borrowing money without oversight from them. They could set up subsidiary businesses. One very entrepreneurial foundation trust in the northeast of England now provides car leasing for the whole of the NHS in the north of England, and also provides payroll and other financial services, but run through a subsidiary profit-making business. They had freedom to on capital spending, although again there were some controls on this, and the Treasury controls on the approval of very large schemes, I think, still applied. They could buy and sell property, and within limits they could adjust the governance to fit local circumstances. Excuse me. If you've got organisations that can go bankrupt or fail in a market, then there needs to be some method for dealing with failure. And given that there is these are public corporations and the assets can't be sold, a standard insolvency regime, a commercial bankruptcy regime, does not work very well. So it was necessary to develop a regime for dealing with failure, and it proved to be quite difficult to develop this. One was developed in the end, and the process involved appointing a special administrator, but I think it's fair to say it was not a very satisfactory element of the policy. To become a foundation trust, you had to show that you had viable plans, that you were performing against the government's key targets, that you had a business strategy, and there was a good fit with that strategy about what the local health system that the hospital was serving. So you couldn't, although people tried, develop strategies that assumed that you would take lots of work from hospitals around you if that wasn't something that the local payers thought was an appropriate way forward. People certainly did plan to become more attractive, particularly for planned surgery, but you had to show that what you were doing had a good fit with the objectives of the health system that you operated in. You had to show that you had good quality governance and management, and that the organisation was well led, and that you had properly consulted with the stakeholders about the proposals to become a foundation trust. If you could pass all of these tests, you would be approved, although there may be conditions about that. And in some cases, the condition would say if you're a provider of some types of essential services, that you had to continue to provide those. You couldn't decide that, for example, that providing emergency general medicine was losing you money, and that you wanted to stop doing it if that was a key part of the pattern of local services. So there were some constraints on what you're allowed to do. So at this point, I'll hand over to Helen, who will talk a bit about the governance arrangements.
Thank you, Nigel. So yes, I'm going to touch on the governance and the oversight arrangements of foundation trusts, at least in principle. And probably the key difference for foundation trusts compared to NHS trusts, to hospitals who are not in this regime, is the way that their directors are appointed. So Nigel said earlier that all provider organisations have the ability to hire and fire, and that's true. but at the most senior level, at the director level, for NHS trusts, those director appointments are made by national bodies. And for foundation trusts, the appointments are made essentially by the local community. So as we said, in terms of policy, part of what was wanted to be achieved was a sense of local accountability. So the non-executive directors for foundation trusts are appointed by what's called the Board of Governors, and that's made up of representatives of local communities and other local partners, and I'll come on to that in a little bit more detail in the next slide. The non-exec directors then appoint the executive directors, and then that creates your trust board. And I think the second important thing to note from a governance perspective is that that trust board is a unitary board, so that once people are on the board, regardless of the role that they have an equal role in decision making. And when Monitor is scrutinising, or was scrutinising foundation trusts, one of the things they looked to see was that there was a good kind of corporate understanding of the issues being faced by the foundation trust in their local area, and the strategy of the trust and how those two related. So, for example, they would expect the nurse director to have a good grasp of the financial issues facing the organisation. They would expect the director of finance to have a good grasp of any quality issues in the organisation. And they would expect non-exec directors to have, obviously, a grasp of the issues in the round. Monitor, as the national regulator, obviously, as you just stated, doesn't appoint the board members, but Monitor does have power to remove board members. So, if there is a significant issue in an organisation, one of the powers that Monitor had as the regulator was to say, actually, we think this organisation needs a new chair, a new chief executive, and they could exercise those powers and remove individuals. In practice, there were very few actual formal removals of executive or non-executive members, but there was quite a lot of conversation behind the scenes, so that Monitor would make it known that they had a concern, that they felt that perhaps this individual wasn't the right person for the challenges faced by the organisation. And as I say, may not have been formal removals, but there were certainly resignations. And the trust chair chairs both the trust board and the board of governors. So if you can move to the next slide, Nigel, we can see how that works in practice. So the governors, as I say, are made up of people who are elected or appointed by relevant stakeholders. So every foundation trust has a number of what's described as constituencies of public members. So generally, those are people who live in the local area. And I say generally because, of course, there are foundation trusts that provide services over a much wider footprint. There are some organisations that provide services nationally. So more specialist trusts will have a local constituency, and then they'll have a national constituency as well. And each of those constituencies elects governors. Anybody who lives within the constituency can choose to be a member of their foundation trust. It doesn't cost anything. You simply sign up and say, I'm interested, I want to influence what happens in my local hospital. And your involvement can be as little as receiving newsletters, or as much as becoming active and actually putting yourself forward to being a governor yourself. The second group of people who elect governors are the staff. So again, one of the principles was that foundation trusts should be accountable to their staff as well as to their local communities. And so staff elect members to the Board of Governors as well. And then finally, local partners. So these might be the local councils, they might be the local voluntary sector, any organisation that the trust thinks is significant in its local system could be asked to appoint a partner governor. But a bit like the board, once everybody's been elected or appointed onto the Board of Governors, the roles are the same. So the role of the public governor is the same as the role of the partner governor once you're on that board. And the main role of the Board of Governors is essentially to hold the trust board to account, which they do through the appointment of the chair and the non-executive directors. And governors have a right to be consulted on very significant strategic decisions, but there is no precise definition of very significant strategic decisions, and that has led to some tensions in some places between boards and governors. The board then, of course, in addition to its accountability to the local population, has also got some accountabilities to its purchasers. So the purchasers are setting out the amount of money they're prepared to make available to the organisation, whether that's through payments for activity or whether that's through block payments, and what they expect to see in return, whether that's volume of activity or quality of activity. And the regulators, so Monitor is the organisation that regulates foundation trusts, the Care Quality Commission as the quality regulator also have expectations on the board. And the board delivers its business essentially through its subcommittees. So there will be subcommittees that look at the finance, there'll be subcommittees that look at quality, there might be subcommittees that look at the quality of estates if there's a particular issue in a local area. This is an example of where trusts are able to set their own governance arrangements. So boards can have as many or as few subcommittees as they want, as long as they can demonstrate their governance structure allows them to do the business they need to do. And of course, the day-to-day operations of the organisation are delivered through the executive directors and their teams. So Nigel, if we move to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about oversight and actually what Monitor's role was in relation to foundation trusts. So this was designed to be really quite a light touch arrangement, that once Monitor had authorised a foundation trust, had assessed that, said in their opinion this organisation is capable of running autonomously, then their role was really to receive information from the trust on a regular basis that demonstrated, hopefully, that the trust was running itself in an efficient and economic manner and was delivering its accountabilities to its local communities. And essentially, Monitor would not step in unless they reached a conclusion that the board was not demonstrating that it was capable of running itself as an organisation. So they calculated a risk rating, and in a moment I'll come on to describing how they did that. And the level of risk that Monitor identified determined the level of scrutiny that Monitor would place on the organisation. But I think one of the things that's important to be clear about is that what Monitor were doing was expecting the board to manage its business. So the fact that a problem might arise in an organisation was not in itself a cause for concern for Monitor. What they looked for was whether the board understood the problem, understood why it had arisen, and had a good plan, what Monitor regarded as a good plan to address the problem. And if they did, then they would leave them to get on with it. If they didn't, then they would step in with further actions up to and including, as I say, potentially the removal of directors. And when Monitor were looking at what they consider to be a problem, essentially what they're looking at is how good the board is at understanding and managing its business. So in a sense, a good problem could be just as bad in Monitor's eyes as a bad problem. So one of the things that Monitor looked for was a good financial plan, and they measure variance against that plan. We might expect Monitor to step in if a trust had a significant negative variance against the plan, and they would do. But they would also actually step in if there was a significant positive variance. So if a trust had planned to break even and then actually returned a significant surplus, Monitor would also want to understand what was going on there. What was the quality of, what had gone wrong with the quality of financial forecasting in that organisation? So Nigel, if we move to the final slide on oversight, we'll look at some of the factors that Monitor looked at when they were calculating their risk rating. So particularly in the early days of foundation trust, there was a very, very strong emphasis on the financial robustness of the organisation. And Monitor looked at a number of different measures to assess that. Now, the risk rating that I pulled up here, as Nigel said, things evolved over time. So this is the risk rating that Monitor used towards the end of the foundation trust policy. So they looked at 4 different factors on financial criteria, and each one had an equal weighting. But they learned from some of the issues in the early days that they also needed to pay close attention to issues that were not financial. So they needed to pay close attention to what was happening in terms of performance standards. Are trusts meeting the national standards in terms of how long people are expected to wait for care? Are trusts meeting the standards in terms of the quality of care that people provided? To Nigel's point about the strategy needing to fit in with the strategy for the local system, they would listen to local purchasers, to local authorities, to understand whether the foundation trust was a good local player, it was a good corporate body in that local system. And both the risk ratings, in a sense, had equal weight. So the financial risk rating and the governance risk rating were considered together. So it's not good enough for an organisation to have a strong financial risk rating. If there was a poor governance risk rating, then Monitor would still step in. And towards the end of the foundation trust regime, as we'll come and talk about some of the lessons learned in a moment. But Nigel mentioned the need for a failure regime. There was a regime developed called special measures. So if a trust was seen to be really failing badly on either its finance or its governance, then it could be placed into special measures. And we have special measures regimes for finance and special measures regimes for quality. And Nigel, I think that's a good point to hand back to you to talk about actually what did happen.
Thanks, Helen. Foundation trusts were generally quite slow to exploit their freedoms. There were a few that quite quickly got on with doing things differently, developing new services. But in general, people took a bit of time to find their way and to understand what having these additional freedoms actually meant. Central government quickly became nervous. There was a change in the Secretary of State who, despite the fact he was from the same political party as Alan Milburn, who had originated this policy, didn't seem to fully understand its implications and tried to reassert control. There was also an anxiety about capital spending because effectively there was now a part of government able to spend capital without the controls required to try and to ensure that as a country, capital controls were properly in place. Although it has to be said that the overall scale of healthcare spending on capital in the UK is terribly low. It's one of our major problems. And as Helen said, we also tended to underspend it. But certainly they became quite nervous over time. So I think a lesson, if you're going down this route, is to be very clear about what are the controls on capital and how far are we happy to have capital spent by autonomous hospitals that's not part of the overall government regime on capital. Some of the incentives built into the system, combined with the relative autonomy and independence that you've heard about Foundation Trust, did mean in a couple of cases that trusts really lost their focus on quality and were chasing some of the financial indicators. And initially, certainly, Monitor did not take a view that it had to take a strong interest in quality. They thought they could leave that up to the regulator. It turned out the regulators are not very good at spotting major problems with quality either. And there was a significant scandal at Mid-Staffordshire hospitals where there were very big breaches in standards of care. Patients undoubtedly died as a consequence of some debate about how many, but certainly very poor care was delivered. And this does seem to have been as a consequence of the hospital's board losing its way. Now, I think they could probably have lost their way without being a foundation trust, but the issue here, I think, was it was felt that the incentives to comply with the Monitor financial regime, combined with light touch oversight, did allow a gap through which a significant quality failing was able to escape the oversight machinery that should normally have caught it. So, and because the NHS in England operates in such a very high visibility media environment, whereas I remember Sir Robert Francis, who chaired the inquiry into this scandal, presenting to a group of policymakers and hospital CEOs from the USA who were astonished about the level of openness about the scandal and commented that in the US system it would have been hushed up, people would have been paid off and no one would have ever heard about it. But in the media environment and the political environment in the UK, failings of this sort become very visible and to some extent political. So something to think about there when doing this in a national system where there has been an expectation that ministers are responsible for everything that happens. Hence the origin of this of the whole of the movement being a reaction to that, but it's a habit that the British media and British politics and British people have really taken to heart that accountability is still quite centralised. We also found that independence at the hospital level could get in the way of rational solutions to planning services for whole areas, because the focus of the board was on the services of the hospital, the financial well-being of the hospital in situations. So take an example, for example, a situation in which the payers want to centralise services where for operational or quality reasons, it makes sense to have a bigger volume of care. So, for example, the treatment of hyperacute stroke or large, very specialist vascular surgery, for example, abdominal aortic aneurysm repair, and quite a lot of cancer surgeries, where payers have been wanting to have these services focused on hubs, with hospitals that are in the periphery, providing, for example, in the case of cancer, initial diagnosis and screening, chemotherapy, follow-up, end of life, and the main centres doing large scale surgery, the histology, running the trials. When you look from a system point of view, that looks entirely rational. When looked at from the point of view of the board of a foundation trust, it looks like you are losing services, and therefore the independence and autonomy led to them wanting to take a stance in some cases that resisted some of those changes. So that's an issue. If you're interested in integration and system working, highly autonomous hospitals can be an issue. On the other hand, there are advantages. The idea was that everyone would become a foundation trust. It didn't happen. The bar was quite high. It was lowered slightly over the course of the policy, but even so, people hospitals were finding it difficult to meet the criteria. The economic downturn in 2008 made some of the financial goals harder to reach. And to be honest, I think policymakers were losing interest in the idea of autonomous hospitals as a way of driving the system. And over time, the politicians and the NHS together took away or either removed the freedoms, or effectively, by creating rules and other systems, restricted the scope for autonomy. And some of this related to the control of capital. And recent legislation has just been passed which removes some of the freedoms that foundation trusts had to manage their own capital spending. So some lessons. So autonomy can be liberating. It can encourage entrepreneurial leadership, and we saw some excellent examples of this over the period. And I think more autonomy is better than less. Generally, subsidiarity really does help improve the quality of decision making. But there are some tensions. Autonomous hospitals take more risks. Those don't always pay off. Where they do, they can greatly improve services and move things forward. Politicians get very nervous about risk. There's this issue of system working versus individual organisational interests, and there's still a problem that we are in a system where people expect accountability, and foundation trusts, despite their freedoms, found themselves accountable to quite a lot of different parts of the system. Second lesson, it takes time to realise these benefits. So having introduced a policy, you need to be patient. I think, to be honest, in some places, the clinical staff got involved and were sort of behind the idea. And it was a way of, in some places, you could definitely see how being a foundation trust could be used to get clinicians feeling part of this organisation and getting behind its objectives, but not everywhere. And it's overall, the impact of this movement on clinical work seems to be probably relatively small. One really important lesson that a number of countries that Alexandra and I have worked in recently is that you can't just make hospitals autonomous and hope it will all be fine. You do need high quality leadership. The organisations need good management systems, including internal performance management systems, the ability to manage staff. One of the reasons why the freedoms to negotiate pay weren't picked up is that hospitals did not have the staff or the capability who had the ability to do that type of negotiation. And it does need the clinicians to be supportive and engaged. The final lesson I think that we can take from the UK experience is that governments on the whole give power away, but often then want it back again quite quickly afterwards. So there's more to say, but we'll stop at that point and hand back to you for questions, and I will stop sharing my screen at this point. We seem to have lost the audio. Alexandra, I think you're muted. Thank you. Yeah.
Is it okay? Yeah, perfect. So mostly what I would like to ask you when the audience is still thinking in the next questions is mostly to try to understand what do you expect to happen now in the British system.
So the British system has now discovered a new magic answer to solving its problems, which is to try and create more integrated systems, which, to be honest, look rather like well, they've got more local government involvement, but they do look rather like the system of governance that the NHS had in the 1980s. So I think the ambition is to try and get the hospitals to work more closely with primary care and out of hospital services, so-called community services, and to try and get better integration for the management of non-communicable diseases, and so more emphasis on governance at a system level than at an individual organisation level. There's also been an attempt in a number of areas to get hospitals to collaborate more, and indeed in a few cases we've seen the creation of sort of hospital groups. So now, for example, the Royal Free Hospital in North Central London, that some of you may know, also manages a hospital 4 miles to its north and 5 miles to the west, to the east, and then another one 3 miles to the northeast. There's a group, and some of these groups of hospitals to try and spread managerial expertise and get better standardisation. So I think we've moved away from the foundation trust model is very much the product of the idea that having a market was the mechanism for change. People seem to have fallen out of love with market mechanisms, although there's still in planned care a degree to which they operate. But for the management of chronic disease, for improving overall population health, the interest now seems to be to try and get the hospitals more integrated into the local systems in which they work.
Now, regarding the governance of this new, I believe, integrated care trusts, or something like it, how is the governance? Is this quite different from the foundation trusts, or it is similar?
Do you want me to take that one, Nigel?
Well, the point, but yes, please do. But just to say, that the model that's emerged for this type of the governance of these sort of integrated systems is probably not what you would design, because it's emerged from the previous set of structures that didn't work very well, and what's been put in place. But Helen will try and explain this.
I'll try and do it simply without pictures. So the integrated care systems, that kind of clues in the name, that the system is made up of individual organisations. So there is essentially no change to the governance within each individual organisation. So the Foundation Trust governance remains as I described it a few minutes ago, but there's a layer above. You have an integrated care board, which essentially is responsible for healthcare delivery within a local area. So that brings together the different providers in a local area, the hospital, the community services, mental health services, primary care, and also local authority social care services. And sitting alongside that, again with the same chair, you have an integrated care partnership, which is much more focused on, if you like, the health status of communities. So a much wider perspective on how local organisations working together can improve the health of their population, not just through the way in which they deliver healthcare, but through the way in which they create a healthy environment for people to work in. So that's a much wider partnership, and that will include all the healthcare organisations, but also the voluntary sector, perhaps the university, perhaps, other key players in an area. But we can make it much more complicated if you like, but I think we'll probably park it there.
Regarding the role of monitor, is it still there? It has reduced influence in the system.
The monitor's functions have been folded into. So the idea was that there were separate bodies for the payer function, the commissioning function, which is called NHS England. There was then a body that looked after the hospitals that weren't and providers that weren't foundation trusts, and then there was monitor. And effectively, all three of those have now been folded together into a single organisation that is both payer and provider manager. And to some extent policy machine as well, although that's also got very confused. So the clarity, the advantage that monitor had, I think, and Helen was on the board, and so perhaps can comment better than I can, but from an external perspective, the big advantage was it was really focused and knew on the providers and knew what it was doing. And did not have to balance and didn't have some of the complexities of having to balance multiple competing priorities in the way that a combined organisation now does.
Right. There are some CEOs in the room, and I have a question that is how the CEO was appointed in the foundation trusts.
Helen, do you want to?
Yeah. So the chief executive was appointed by the non-executive directors and the chair of the organisation, who in turn themselves were appointed by the governors. Chief executive appointment had to be ratified by the governors, but it was actually made by the non-executive directors. So that in a foundation trust, there is no requirement for the involvement of any national organisation in that appointment. In practice, actually, quite often the foundation trust would invite somebody from the regional office of the national organisation to sit on the selection panel, because of that point about the foundation trust is still being part of a system, but that was a choice they made rather than a requirement.
Thank you so much. I don't know if you have some questions from the room. Oh, lots of them. Delphine.
Okay, thanks a lot for both your outstanding presentations. And one of the things that impressed me so much, and the question is directly to Nigel, according to your point of view, why more autonomy led to few clinical outcomes?
Yes, that is a good. I mean, I think the point is we don't really have we can't see any clear evidence that it did. I think that probably where the autonomy was done well, it improved the culture of the organisation. It did. My observation was you did feel that the clinicians felt they were part of something that was good. I mean, some of that probably did translate into outcomes. It's just we've not been able to find it in sort of research terms. It's also slightly confounded by the fact that the hospitals that became foundation trusts were already good. So actually, we can't really see a difference in. You can't see discontinuities in outcomes. But I think my presumption would be that feeling of getting your clinicians on behind you, that they feel engaged with the organisation, almost certainly does turn into high quality outcomes. I think the point of the slide was probably we need to be cautious of claiming that it will, but I think there's quite a good reason, there's probably quite good reason to believe that it had a beneficial effect, which would, not directly on outcomes, but would translate into outcomes. I think there might actually, think about it, I might be being also a little bit, I can think of examples where foundation trusts were able to develop services by technology, change the way they did things, which probably did improve outcomes. And the reason they could do that was because they were foundation trusts. So the connection's not absolutely direct, but there probably are some examples. Actually, we need to be less definite in the slides, I think, maybe.
We need to understand also that probably foundation trusts were much more audits than other organizations. So actually you can see what is happening more clearly than in other organizations. Professor, também queria fazer uma pergunta.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I was very interested in hearing all these things because some years ago, I'm not saying to say how many, I was a clinical assistant in London at St. Thomas's Hospital. And at that time, the system was working pretty well and the doctors were satisfied. Nowadays, at least in Portugal, we are speaking that one of the problems is the clinicians are not satisfied, they are bored, they are not enjoying what they are doing. And so my question is, what's happening now in England? Is there also this problem of the dissatisfaction and this problem of boring of the clinicians because all these changements that have occurred in these recent years, or not? And if there is, because you spoke about the influence of the trust in the clinical involvement and in clinical patterns, as the LFA said. So what's the situation now with the doctors, with these changements in the National Health Service of England? Thank you.
Good question. I mean, to be honest, quite a lot of changes in governance are not noticed by many frontline clinical staff. And I've never been sure if that is a good or a bad thing. The concerns of most clinicians at the moment in the NHS is the volume of work that they're required to do, the pace at which the system operates, the difficulty in creating continuity of care for doctors within the hospital. I mean, I think actually, because we have now put a lot of effort into getting clinicians and in particular doctors involved in management and leadership in their organisations, they do feel connected to the organisation. Much of the structural change that Helen was describing and other things that have happened actually on the whole have not had very much effect on hospital governance. So a lot of the extraordinary change and churn that we see in the NHS's structures has largely been on the sort of pay and regulatory side, not on the hospital side. And of course, what happens to the payers, it doesn't have that much impact on the doctors. There have been a lot of mergers and amalgamations of services and hospitals over the last 20 years, and the number of independent hospital organisations now has reduced. So that will have had an impact. But even then, the actual impact on the day-to-day job of the doctors isn't from some of those changes on the whole, unless you're, say, amalgamating two hospitals that both have a cardiology department, and you're going to create a single department where there's some change, but that's not the major. So organisational change is probably not the main source of dissatisfaction, which we also have. That's more to do with the fact that we've not properly invested in staff, in nursing staff, in equipment to support them. We've taken away their facilities. We don't feed them at night. They've been asked to work increasingly hard without perhaps without recognition that that's been happening. Those are probably more important issues than organisational change, which for most of them, many of this has not had very much direct impact. I don't know, Helen, would you agree with that?
Absolutely, I'd agree. I mean, I think this is thinking about it at a national level, the 8th major reorganisation of the NHS in my career, which is just shy of 30 years now, and probably the only one, the first one that actually does have the potential for a more direct impact on the way clinicians deliver care, but not because of the governance arrangements that are being put in place, more because of the policy emphasis on integration and the join up of services and the connections to local communities. And that approach could flourish in a number of different organisational structures. So that's I think Nigel's right. At the moment, what clinicians are interested in is actually, have I got the resources at my disposal to deliver good quality care for the patients who are coming through the door? And they're stressed because the answer to that question is no. They're not stressed because of the restructure of the NHS.
No, thank you so much. I don't know if you have more questions from the room. I will ask you both mostly some takeaway messages or lessons learned.
Sure. I think the lesson for me is that really well managed hospitals who've got their clinicians engaged and have a good level of autonomy, but also understand that they're part of the system in which they operate, is a much more effective method of governing your hospital system than a top-down system controlled by a ministry. But don't expect the governments to give away power and never want it back again.
Sure. Helen?
I would agree with that one. I mean, I think good governance in an organisation is really important, but it's not an end in itself. The point is what you are trying to achieve, both at an organisational level and at the level of the individual patient. And actually, so what's important is that you've got good governance systems that will deliver those outcomes, not good governance systems to be able to tick the box for a national organisation.
Well, thank you so much both. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Nigel. Hope to see you soon and work together soon. And it was a pleasure. You can enjoy your morning. Thank you so much for giving your time for this Saturday morning to us, and see you soon. Thank you so much. Nós vamos, entretanto, continuar. Vamos ter também agora, essencialmente, discutir o modelo holandês. Para isso temos o Patrick Jeurissen, que nos vai apresentar também um modelo inglês, um modelo bastante diferente e distinto do modelo inglês, uma vez que é um modelo que os hospitais, na prática, são todos na prática privados, não lucrativos, mas privados, e vai-nos também apresentar um modelo de regulação que funciona no modelo holandês. Patrick, thank you so much for being with us. It's a nice pleasure. Last time we saw each other was in Cyprus some few years ago. We worked together since then, but the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Senhoras e senhores, convosco Patrick Jeurissen, da Radboud Institute for Health Sciences.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to tell you something about managed competition in the Netherlands and how it has affected hospitals. That would be my main takeaway. And I think there are up front a couple of things you should know. One is that hospitals in the Netherlands are all private, non-profit institutions. It's not allowed to distribute any dividends, so there's not much use in being a for-profit hospital. And there is no public hospitals, not a single one. So they're all basically self-regulated. And the boards are two-tier boards. So you have a board, people apply to be on a board, 5-7 people, and they hire or fire the hospital administration. That's the main task. That's basically no other ones, so not involved in direct daily running of it. I would say hospitals are comparatively efficient. Managed competition has held up quite well, but we have some challenges. That would be my main thing. So this is about me. I authored or co-authored 3 books on hospitals. So most of what I'm telling you would be in one of those places, and you can find them on the internet. So first, because it was asked, I'm going to tell you something about hospital ownership and what science or studies tell about it, then about hospital care in the Netherlands, then about regulated competition in the Netherlands, which is a very complex story, so I'll try to do that brief, and then how regulated competition shapes hospitals, and then what are the state the sector is in now, and what I would call the Bermuda Triangle of Dutch hospitals. So hospital ownership. So I think a couple of things are important. First is that typically, not in the Netherlands, but in most countries, I assume also in Portugal, different hospital ownership types coexist. So you should have typically for-profit, non-profit and public hospitals, so you can compare. But, and I think that's also what Nigel was making the point in hospital care, there is a rather big gap between formal ownership and effective ownership. And that, of course, is that because politicians might intervene. You can be the owner, but they might intervene. All kinds of stuff. And we see a lot of variety also in what exactly is a hospital. So in the Netherlands, a hospital is typically very big, lots of tertiary care, but I'll go into that later on. What you see here is in 4 countries, and you see the amount of the private sector. And you see it's rising in all these 4 countries, so UK, Germany, US and the Netherlands. But the lighter grey areas are left-wing governments, and the darker grey areas are right-wing government. And you basically see that, at least in these 4 countries, over the long term, it doesn't seem to matter a whole lot what is the political orientation of the government. So over the long run, we see a rise in, say, private hospitals in most countries. So what do we know? We know typically that for-profit hospitals or private hospitals in general are more responsive to incentives, all incentives. So if you have good incentives, that might be a good thing. If you have not so good incentives, that might be a bad thing. They have better access at least to equity capital. Typically, but a lot of variety, they have somewhat lower costs. So a lot of studies say they might be more efficient, but almost always they have higher prices because they have higher markups and higher margins. So, and that's, you know, a political decision, you know, where you want to be. And a lot of these institutions, as a business model, they seek to connect with physicians. That's, for example, what the independent sector in the UK does. It's basically a model also for physicians. And that's also the case in the US. Now, what's good about these hospitals, that they typically are good consolidators. They are good at turnaround management. They can buy out, say, public hospitals that are not doing so well and turn them around. That's a good thing. So you also see different outcomes depending on what type of study you have. Cross-sectional would be more like it's not so good. Longitudinal is much more better. Now PPPs, of course, is more or less the same, but they don't have the ownership incentive because they typically are not the owner, so that has all kinds of consequences for example, capital investments. Now we did a study which was published not so long ago, systematic review on what type of hospital is good in increasing quality and lower costs, which is a big thing in the Netherlands. So many people are thinking, you know, more quality means lower costs, which of course is true, but also a lot of times not true. But so we did a study on it, and we basically find 5 takeaways. So those hospitals have upfront investments. Those hospitals have strong role of professionals. bottom-up incentives. So professionals are in the lead typically of telling, the board, other ones, what they should do to improve quality of care. Many pilots, and then there's kind of spinning wheel with crosses over the entire hospital. Good information systems, and no payment barriers. I'm not saying payment incentives. On purpose, I say no barriers. That's probably the best you can do. No barriers. So this is about kind of general about hospital care. Now then, if we go to the Netherlands, there are a couple of takeaways. So our doctors is declining, but still 50% is self-employed. And that's the main governance kind of challenge for all boards. They are not individually self-employed. They are in a company, and that company negotiates with the board on things like reimbursement of physicians inside the hospital. So it's the strongest force. I already told you all hospitals, private, non-profit, 75 in this 17 million country. So that's huge, and so we have a very high penetration of tertiary care. I tell people, 26 tertiary care hospitals, 8 university medical centers. Boston would be a place where you have that within, say, a space of 100 square kilometers, but we also. So nice country for trials and pharmaceutical industry, etc., 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 etc. Very high research outputs also. But still a very small sector, moderate sector, 30% of total health expenses would go to hospital care. We have huge long-term care, big primary care, but not so very big hospital care sector. And the last one, also very important, very liberal regulations. You can more or less, I wouldn't say do as you please, but 70% of prices are totally free. So that's a lot, 70% of turnover. It's totally free. You negotiate with your insurance company what it would be, etc. You can buy a new hospital or build a new hospital without a permit by the government. You don't need it. You only need a bank that gives you money. Not all do, by the way, but I'll come into that. But very, very liberal. You can contract a hospital as an insurer, or you cannot. And increasingly do. Now, I say small hospital, low inpatient stays. So you see the Netherlands here on the orange, the upper left corner, which is the corner of low inpatient care, high outpatient care, which is basically what you need. What you would say, which is good. You don't want to have people too much as an inpatient in the hospital. You want to have them outpatient, and you don't have too much of it, which is left. People in emergency rooms, you see the Netherlands here in Europe, all the way down. Very few people visit emergency rooms in the hospitals in the Netherlands because of strong primary care, also out of office. So some people call this efficiency. Now, if you look at the numbers of day surgeries on the left, you see here again the Netherlands, it's the lowest in comparison with another couple of countries. And if you look at the right-hand side for you, Netherlands would be green. You see that's the percentage of certain elective surgeries that's being done in day treatment, and you see it's much higher than in other European countries. So in cataract surgery, for example, it's 100%, and in hernia it would be like 80 or 90. So it's a lot of it is outpatient oriented. So the sector. So the big takeaway is not big. Seems to be efficient in indicators like this. Now this is a slide which I had to present at the Chinese Communist Party a couple of years ago, and they gave me 5 minutes and one slide. So this is the slide, and I'm not going to go all over it, but the takeaway is basically that it's a circle, which is that it's self-steered, self-governed, and you see the governance mechanisms in the middle. So the idea is we guarantee solidarity, we guarantee universal access, we guarantee choice, and then there is a system that's starting to run, and if something's not going right, this is all theory, by the way, right? So it's not a marketing speech or something, but if something's not going right, somebody will intervene. Might be a competition authority, might be another regulator, might be the government, inspectorate, you know, all kind of stuff. Those are in the middle. And the key thing is actually selective purchasing. So the idea is insurance companies pay, let's say hospitals, but they pay 95%, over 95% actually, of their expenses in claims to healthcare providers. So they don't use a lot of money for themselves, like 2.5, 2.6%. They don't also are allowed to distribute dividends. So lots of money goes to the providers. And then, of course, the idea is that they somehow need to be able to steer that amount of money, and they do that by active purchasing. And then the hospitals want to have a contract on attractive conditions, and they do that by innovation, and that would increase productivity. This is the theory, right? So, and you see that here. This is there's all kind of principles, you know, that are in the system, institutions to kind of do that. Like there's a basic benefit packages, there's community rating for solidarity. Very sophisticated risk adjustment, so we know, you know, what would be the expenses of the typical patient in the next year, and insurers will be adjusted for that. Open enrollment, risk. Nigel was saying politicians do not like risk. He's probably right, but we have a lot of risk in the system because it's basically the heart of the whole thing. Workable competition, contract freedom, I already told it. That's not to say that there are no political disputes. There are. They're on the right-hand side. So a big dispute is about money. So the government says we want to have a global budget. We don't want you to spend more than 10, 11% of GDP, which is kind of what the healthcare currently spends. Some economists would say that's not okay because, you know, we have a market, and if the market say it's 12, it should be 12. But the government says no. So that's one dispute. Trust is a dispute. In the system, people were telling you if we make healthcare transparent, quality of care transparent, etc., that would increase trust. I don't believe that actually, but you know, this trust is, I think, a force in itself. Trust in physicians, trust in the system. Profit making is basically strongly disincentivized. Some people don't think that should be able, but I must say I think the system works quite well, and probably because it's competition, but basically in a private non-profit environment. Free choice of physician is still allowed, is still there on the Dutch law, but some people say that shouldn't be the case because insurers should basically be able to steer to what physician a patient goes. So these are kind of disputes. Then how does it work? So I have 7 takes for you. First, about expenses. Very positive, I would say. So we came from a history of overspending before the red line. Every year, 2 years overspending. And when the system really started to work, because there was putting risk into the system in 2012, you see we have a history of underspending. And now, for the last 10 years, healthcare has underspent 17 billion euros. So that's a lot of money. Underspent. They were allowed to spend, but they did not. Basically because insurance companies were constraining resources. So you see here on the right, the Netherlands in the middle, you see that, you know, we were a high spender in growth, but you see how we slowed all the way down, and we now have like 1% real expense growth a year. Way lower than the other European countries. And I remember, Alexander, when we were there, we were still quite high spending. We were like second or third in OECD, and now we are like 15. And this has basically happened in the last 10 years. So I would say that's a success. At the same time, and that's even more success, we see that hospitals became very strong financially. So you look here on the right side, that's the solvency, the average solvency in the Netherlands, the red, and you see it's going up. And the average solvency of Dutch hospitals now is 30%, which is higher than most listed for-profit hospital global companies. So very, very strong capitalized system. Insurance companies is the same, by the way. So in the last 10, 15 years, lots of money on the balance sheets of providers and insurance companies, which are not on the balance sheet of the government, but it's somehow there. And of course, it creates a lot of flexibility in daily decisions and investments and stuff like that. The other takeaway, a little bit less positive, but that's what markets do. You see we have more rich hospitals, so the upper line, and we have more, say, poorer hospitals. And you see that it's diverting. And that's basically, of course, what competition does, creating winners, creating not so winners, right? So that's what we see in it's going very slowly, but in all parts of the healthcare system we see that, basically. Hospitals have, I was telling you about the underspending, but that was not so much because of the hospitals. The hospitals are the dark blues on the left, the left figure. That was actually basically in outpatient care. But the consequence of that was that hospital spending is growing as fast as primary care, pharmaceuticals, which is in an area that we don't need as much inpatient care, quite politically quite good, I would say. So take 3, not so good also. We used to have lots of investments. So 10% of hospital spending every year was capital. And you see here that is declining. So banks do not give so much money anymore. If you look at the interest spread, so how much do banks earn on hospital loans, you see it's rising quite a lot, which basically means that banks are charging higher rates to hospitals, which is strange because hospitals are formally getting much stronger financially. So it actually tells more about a very consolidated banking sector probably than about the financial strength of hospitals. Now, another worrying thing is that in our whole idea is active purchasing. So insurers should reward good providers and punish not so good providers. Now we try to check that in a couple of studies, which are actually still under review, and you shouldn't look at the peaks. Those are a big reform and you shouldn't look at it. But this is the market volatility in different segments of the Dutch healthcare sector. And we would expect that market volatility in healthcare, in hospital care, would be bigger than, say, in nursing home care or home care, because they are not into the market system. They're still public. But that's not what we see. So hospitals here are the purple all the way down. So that basically tells us that very few money is being shifted from the one hospital to the other hospital on an annual basis. Does it matter if you're a hospital, if you have a contract with an insurance company? That's on the right-hand side. You see everything's close to zero. It doesn't matter. So that's worrying. It means basically that insurance companies constrain costs, and that's what they do, but they're not so much rewarding better performing hospitals and punishing not so good performing hospitals. And we see also, and that's on the right, you cannot, but that's a same study, we looked at quality of care, and you also see there's no relation to quality of care of individual hospitals and their market share. In other words, if you increase quality of care, you do not get more patients from the insurers. So that's also not so good. Another one is fragmentation. So in the Netherlands we have rather high administrative expenses. So this is a study I also was involved in. It's somewhat older data, but it's Netherlands second after the US. 20% overhead in Dutch hospitals, overhead costs. That does not include the time physicians and nurses are not seeing patients, which typically is around 2 days a week. So if you add it all, and you include the central overhead of the ministry and all the regulatory bodies, you could say that somewhere between 40 and 50% of healthcare expenses are indirect costs, are not patient related, which I would say is too much. And we don't know, but we typically know that this is higher in private systems, with here, US, Netherlands, and that, for example, if you go in the bottom, it's the UK, you see it's less in public systems, typically. Because in private systems you have bills and claims, and you simply have contracts, you typically have more paperwork. Now, what we also saw is lots of new providers. You see here the number of ambulatory surgery clinics rising very steeply, and I don't have figures because it's rather splintered, but we saw also lots of innovations, new models of care for people with dementia, oncology, Parkinson's, digital health, heart failure, lots of things going on, basically. But not so much scaling up. And that's because of, so we have 1,000 flowers, but we keep 1,000 flowers and we not have one big one, so it's, and that's of course the problem with multiple payers who compete with each other, and also typically multiple providers who need to cooperate in these new kinds of ways of making these innovations come true. So what's the takeaway then? So how did it go? Strong growth in slowing in cost, which is of course very good for the government. Strong capitalization, which is also very good, but more rich, more poor providers. Sector holds up quite well financially compared to other sectors. Constraints on investments. Not critical, but shouldn't go like this for another 10 years. A higher cost of capital. The big thing is that active purchasing, which is kind of the central idea of that whole reform, is working, but not so much in rewarding good providers and say punishing bad providers. Probably managed competition increases administrative expenses, and we have a lot of new models and a lot of innovation, but we do have some problem with scaling it up across the country. So I don't know how much time I have. Do I have 3 more slides? These are all my final slides. Okay. So so this is my personal takeaway. So I think what I call the Bermuda Triangle, which we have. So 3 problems: administrative costs, multi-morbidity. The system is not kind of attached to multi-morbidity. Actually, I don't think that's typically Dutch. I mean, I think that's probably the case everywhere. But patients with multi-morbidity are rising fast, have much higher expenses, and have way worse outcomes. And we should have much more better models of care that treat people with multi-morbidity. And we have a huge tertiary care, which is very nice. But it's also very expensive, and it's very hard politically also from the perspective of hospital administrators, to make choices in things like tertiary care, volume thresholds, how much, for example, we have 3 proton beamers in the Netherlands, which is a lot considering that there is fuel effectiveness that and it's like 200 million euros a piece. Of course, we have all kind of scientific theories which kind of somehow relate to the triangle. We have the triple aim, which is population-based and basically tells us that if we do more prevention, if we do better quality of care, we will have lower per capita cost, and that would be good. I'm not so sure. And then we have all kind of organization kind of theories which basically said we need to organize hospitals in a different way. So we need to look at networks, say elective surgery and value-added business process and solutions for tertiary care, and then we come with stuff like lean and those kind of things. So my big, and I think that was all for my big thing, is that the professionals, especially after COVID, are starting to drown a little bit within that triangle. I mean, a lot of people are running away because they simply think, for example, primary care doctors, they need to work 25 hours on administrative stuff each week. So they simply stop or don't go anymore. So I think the middle is the workforce. And the workforce is being hurt by administrative, expensive bureaucracy. The workforce cannot always give best care because, you know, they don't have the patient is multimorbid and they don't control the whole thing, and there is not a good model of care, and these people are all away in the system. And you can see it here. This is a study we did. You see the cost, you see the number of diseases on the X. And if you have 11 diseases, this is I think 2012 expenses in one of the big Dutch insurance companies, and you see that it's rising. So the more diseases you have, the higher the amount of money that's being spent. So I think, you know, that you know what we do in appropriate care, we look at, you know, can we make cataract even more cheap? I think we do very good with cataract, but we should look at this. How do we make sure that our healthcare systems treat those patients kind of in an efficient and effective way? And I think that's the future. And so I think we did well, I think, comparatively for the last 10 years. But that doesn't mean that we don't have any problems, because of course every era has its own challenges. And I think now we have these one. Okay, so I leave it with that.
Thank you so much, Patrick. I don't know if you have some questions from the audience. Também dou nota às pessoas que estão em casa que podem colocar perguntas na plataforma. Patrick, one of the questions that I believe that is quite interesting, and I think really that is enlightening, that actually the Dutch system is really probably one of the most innovative systems in Europe regarding provision of care. But you said here that there is a limitation regarding the
scaling up
of those innovations.
Yeah.
How you plan to address it?
Yeah, so the problem is, so we have 11 insurance companies. And if one insurance company invests in an innovation, they are scared that they also invest for the other 10. Okay. Because typically a doctor would call it unethical to give, say, an innovative, good treatment to patients from insurance company A and not for insurance company B. So one of the problems is that insurance companies need to align on these innovations. And they try to do more better and better, but that's one problem. The other thing is that typically I would say for a lot of these innovations you need a hospital, but you also need home care, you need primary care, maybe even a nursing home care for certain patients, and then they need to have their own deliberations about money and who does what, and that's also a problem. So the thing is basically that if you compete on risk and on financial rewards, that can somehow come in between of, say, scaling it up. Not so much creating it. I mean, creating it is going very well. So we have lots of experiments, lots of pilots, lots of things, also with very good outcomes actually. But it's very hard to, for example, I'm conducting in a study where we do dementia care around the GP in a network, and we find 20% less hospital admissions. So you would expect, that it would be spread over the country, and it's not. It's not. So those. I mean, I think the competition is in the way.
In the case of the Dutch system, we heard Nigel talking a little bit about the integration between hospitals and primary care and long-term services. Is it possible for the Dutch system to see that integration, or it's regulated to have this, or to continue to have this fragmentation between primary care and hospitals?
It is, I think theoretically it's possible. But of course, I mean, we basically have three systems. So we have, and that also makes it more difficult because these systems are very different. So we have acute care, which is competition. And we have long-term care, which is no competition.
That is funded by municipalities, I believe, no?
No, and then we have social care, which is municipalities, which is also, and that means you have very different systems who work very differently in lots of respects. For example, I'm involved with a mental health provider in the south of the country, 40 million euros annual turnover, and he has 11 insurance companies, one care office for long-term care, the Ministry of Justice for forensic care, and around 10 municipalities.
So it's hard.
And you have to negotiate with all of them on different conditions and on different and that's it's a lot.
Just to finalize, one of the issues that even for the Dutch system is that the healthcare system, I believe, that supports and promotes the development of biotech industry.
Yeah.
What do you think it is the role of this competitive system and the development of biotech in the Netherlands, that is probably one of the leading countries now in Europe?
I think the main reason why the Netherlands is an interesting country for biotech and big pharma is not because of payment policies, because Dutch people don't take a lot of pharmaceutical prescriptions. Costs are typically rather low, really low. They don't have a lot of political constituency, so they have not a good press, etc., etc. But like I said, where on earth do you find within 100 square kilometers 8 fully equipped university clinics with everything on board, with very highly skilled people, 26 tertiary care hospitals? It's a very nice infrastructure. It's a very nice infrastructure. If you look, for example, and I don't want to do a marketing talk, right? But if you look at, say, example, in med school citation indexes in different fields, you always see the same. You see US 1, UK 2, and then Germany, France, Netherlands, Switzerland, somehow a little bit. And of course, for such a small country, that's kind of says it all. It's very, I think that's basically it. And that's being built up over the last 50 years. I mean, that's not an effect of managed competition. Although, I must say, if you look at the most rich hospitals are the university clinics. So the market power of these big hospitals with the big trials is so huge that insurance companies cannot really touch them.
Just to finalize, we need to move on our program. Some final lessons from the Dutch system that They are difficult to apply in the public system.
Well, if you want to constrain healthcare costs, I think the best lesson is if you put some people on risk for constraining those costs, in our case, insurance companies, it works.
You know, also to explain that the insurance companies and the hospitals, they cannot pay dividends to the owners.
Yeah, they cannot. Yeah, I think that's another lesson. I think we don't have a lot of opportunistic behavior because of this. So I think that's also why we wrote one of those books. Because international people always think Netherlands competition, so it's all profits, and that's exactly not the case. I mean, I think with the exception of Belgium, I don't know about any other country where it's so rigorously forbidden, actually. Yeah.
So, Patrick, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to have you. We will now, agora vamos ter uma apresentação também, e peço, antes de irmos para o intervalo, dos palhaços de hospital, para nos explicar também o que é que estão a fazer atualmente nos hospitais portugueses. Talvez até possam apresentar agora também o nosso colega holandês e transportar esta experiência para a Holanda, mas eu pedia à CEO dos palhaços de hospital para apresentar o projeto e o que é que estão a conseguir fazer atualmente. Thank you, Patrick.